for joining us.
Great, thank you so much. I'm really excited to be a part of today's discussion, to share a little bit of information, but also to learn from all of you. So I've got a few slides that I'm going to have some help with sharing, I think. We could pull those up. And again, I'm Jocelyn Bissonette, she, her, with the Funders Committee for Civic Participation. If we could go to the next slide. Just a little bit about FCCP. We are a funder network, much like the Maine Philanthropy Center. We've got about 100 members, ranging from national to state and local community foundations. You can see our theory of impact here. We believe in a society where communities have the power to make a difference on issues that impact their lives, a culture of participation, and an open and equitable democracy. Next slide. So I want to show this slide because even though we're talking about redistricting today, I want to emphasize that we at FCCP really think about redistricting as one part of this interconnected civic ecosystem. We think of civic engagement as an umbrella term for nonpartisan ideas, activities, and field action, really with equity at the center. We believe that by centering communities, including communities of color, whose voices are most often left out of the democratic decision-making process, we can achieve fair elections and representation, but also advance health equity and environmental equity, education justice, et cetera. So not all members that are part of the FCCP network would consider themselves democracy funders. Some have a dedicated democracy portfolio, and others use civic engagement or democracy grant making to advance their missions. So again, just important, even though we're talking about redistricting, for me to emphasize especially that we really see this as part of an interconnected ecosystem. If we can go to the next slide. I know that many of you worked incredibly hard on the 2020 census, and obviously that is a piece of the infrastructure that's very much connected to redistricting. So there was the big news in April when the apportionment data came out from the 2020 census. Just in a couple of days now, we're going to be getting the redistricting data. Early next year, we'll start to get more of the granular census data that gives us much more information by age, voting population, race and ethnicity. We'll continue to get data quality measures to get a better and better sense of how the 2020 census actually went. And of course, 2030 planning. I have liked to say quite a bit over the last couple of months that the census doesn't end when the counting stops. The 2020 census is still ongoing, even though we're talking about redistricting, and in fact, planning for 2030 is well underway. And so I couldn't have this opportunity to speak with all of you today and not emphasize that if we want the Census Bureau to better center equity in the development of policy operations, we feel it's really critical that philanthropy must leverage its collective voice and platform to help make that possible throughout the decade. And further, if we want the Census Bureau to better center historically undercounted communities in the development of policy and operations, we need to make sure that we're resourcing those organizations well in advance of when the Census Bureau is going to be making those decisions. So if you're interested in thinking through that a bit more, we have developed a 10-year blueprint that kind of outlines some of the key Census Bureau milestones and gives some concrete ways of how funders can engage in this work throughout the decade. And one of those ways certainly is supporting redistricting work, because it is so much, in so many ways, an extension of the census. So if we go to the next slide. So some of this may be review, but I think it's important to mention and to help sort of help ground today's discussion. So obviously the redistricting process follows the census once every 10 years. There's a lot of attention, especially right now, and particularly following the release of the apportionment data on congressional, but we know that the drawing of district lines is not just about the congressional and state legislators, but all the way down to the local level as well. The redistricting process is both an opportunity for communities to build power and achieve fair representation. But has also been a tool to suppress that representation. So I want to dig into that a little bit more. And again, our other speakers are going to be able to provide specific examples from Maine and other places, and really provide much more detail about what this looks like on the ground. So this is just a high level overview. But if we go to the next slide. Why does community mapping matter? And we'll talk a little bit about how funders can participate in this process and why it's important. Redistricting obviously affects who has a voice, who can run for office, who is elected, and all of the policies that come from that representation. Again, maybe it's healthcare, education, criminal justice, et cetera. Communities are served well by being kept whole, and some communities are better served by being split. So really, when we think about why does community mapping matter, it's really about making sure that communities have the opportunity to have a say in who represents them. Communities have the best local knowledge for how to develop maps that can fairly represent their neighborhoods and communities. Historically, we have seen racial gerrymandering, the redistricting process be used as a tool for voter suppression, to pack or crack communities. So either to intentionally pack certain communities together to dilute their power if they were able to be a majority across multiple districts, or the other way around, to break them apart so as to dilute their representation. In our view, racial gerrymandering is again a tool that reinforces institutional racism. And when the voting power of people of color is diluted through redistricting, it not only undermines core democratic values, but undermines community ownership. It changes how community resources are distributed. It changes access to healthcare and how schooling is provided. It changes how police operate and and more generally, how people of color are represented when community decisions are made. So again, sort of back to the very, sort of our very first slide, we really think about this work as all about equity, an opportunity to advance equity, or to step backwards, depending on what the outcomes are. And so for us, part of why funder engagement around redistricting is so critical is that when funders can support the organizations on the ground that are doing this hard work of mapping and trying to secure that fair representation, the process can become less about protecting incumbency, less about one party or another, and more about making sure that communities have a voice in this process. So I want to talk a little bit now about some of the funder infrastructure and resources that exist, and a little bit about how funders can generally can think about engagement. So if we go to the next slide. There is a national funder collaborative called Fair Representation in Redistricting. Some of you may have been plugged into the national census funder infrastructure. So it's many of the same foundations who have chosen to continue to be part of this national collaborative, help generate resources around redistricting. This is all C3 work. You can see that the national collaborative is focusing on states. Obviously, census was sort of a national activity carried out on the ground. As you know very well, redistricting is much more state specific. Every state has its own process and timeline. We're definitely feeling the time crunch, just given the ways in which the pandemic delayed the census timeline. And again, you all know much more about what is happening much more about what's happening in Maine than I do. So a real focus on the states, a focus on using total population. There are emerging efforts in some states to try and redistrict based on only the citizen voting age population, which would it would exclude non-citizens and would exclude children. Again, we think this is incredibly undemocratic and goes against sort of all of the values of making sure that there is fair representation. So again, wanting to make sure that that redistricting is based on total population, and then helping to provide some tools and assistance, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a moment. And then I think the goals here, really resonates again with the same sort of core underlying values that that were the foundation for so much of the census grant making that we saw. Making sure that the maps fairly represent people in their communities, ensuring that the process itself is open and transparent, holding either commissions or the state legislatures accountable for holding those public hearings and being transparent and responsive to the public, and the importance of the public's inclusion in this process. And then again, trying to make sure that we're centering historically undercounted and underrepresented communities through this process. Next slide. So there are also some great resources available for funders. We know that similar to the census, because this happens only once every 10 years, we lose there's lots of staff transition. Most foundations don't have a dedicated, redistricting program officer. So part of what we see FCCP's role in this space is to try and create a community of interested funders to be able to access resources, facilitate connections. You're going to hear from our good friend Kiki from New Jersey in a little bit. He'll talk about how they're approaching this work in New Jersey. And just trying to create this community of funders so that funders don't feel like they have to do this work in isolation. And so you see a few examples of some of the resources that are available. We have a listserv for those that are interested. We send out a couple of updates a month with the latest resources and happenings. We've got a toolkit that provides concrete examples of how funders can engage, but also resources like draft RFPs, for example. We just added a new resource this week that is a one-pager on talking points for foundation boards and leadership. We do know that there is some hesitancy around engaging in redistricting. So, we want to be as helpful as possible in facilitating those internal conversations as well. Next slide. There's also some incredible resources out there for your grantees or potential grantees. Again, many of these are being supported by the National Funder Collaborative. So you can see just three examples here. The Redistricting Data Hub is going to be very active this week in helping to pull and analyze the data that the Census Bureau is going to be releasing into a more user-friendly format. And again, trying to make the process as open and as accessible as possible for communities to be able to engage, to be able to map, to be able to analyze others' maps, to be able to develop and provide public testimony. So again, just trying to make it as easy as possible for community leaders to be able to engage in this process. Next slide. And this is my last slide here, just a couple of examples of the ways that funders can engage in this process. So one is amplification of the core values that we've been talking about today, making sure that communities have an opportunity to participate in the process and that they are centered as part of this process. So usually using your foundation's platform to elevate those core values. to educate leaders, to fund analysis and research, to fund organizations to convene and organize and engage in the community mapping, public education, advocacy, and litigation. And then, of course, if your foundation's not able to provide a redistricting specific grant, we're very supportive of the idea of additional general operating support that makes it easier for nonprofits and other community-based organizations to be able to allocate the resources as they see fit to be able to engage in this process. So that's all I have for you. Happy to answer any questions. And again, look forward to the discussion and to learning from all of you.
Thanks so much, Jocelyn. Are there any questions that folks have for her at this point? Tasha, hi. You can unmute yourself.
Thank you. I don't have a question, but kind of like a statement. That redistricting data and all the gerrymandering, it did exactly what we as an immigrant was afraid of, right? It was really hard to make people do and fill up their paperwork to fill up the census, because a lot of the immigrants, particularly in the Somali community, we were worried that because what we were selling was that it will actually bring a funding and awareness to our community as opposed to redistricting funding from us, right? And so it looks like that's exactly what happened here. Like, what people were worried about and it was very blunt of how actually our elderly said it, was that if we actually count ourselves, it might actually exclude us if the government, that's how they put it, knew how many of us at least live in this particular neighborhood or congregate in certain places in Maine. And I'm afraid that, even though it's not all of it, that's exactly what this data currently is showing. It's not optimistic, and it's going to be hard in the next 10 years to convince people, to do or to count themselves. I guess that's what I want to add.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's such important context. And we know that so many of the actions from the Trump administration made participation in the census more difficult, because there was real fear, that was out there about how the data would be used. And so, I think, I think from our perspective, why we think philanthropic support for this type of work is so important is because, sort of as you suggest, it's so much more than about just having somebody complete a form. It's about building community and building power. And trusted community leaders are are really at the center of all of that process, and they need to be resourced in a way to be able to do their work effectively, because it's not just a one-time action that all of us are hoping to achieve. It's stronger communities that can be fairly represented and that can benefit from policies that are reflective of their community needs. So thank you for sharing that. It's really important.
Are there any more questions for Jocelyn? Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Jocelyn. Oh, Pius does have a question. So Pius, I will ask you to unmute yourself and you can go ahead.
Thank you, Jocelyn. I may have missed some of I was in another meeting. I came in late. My only question is, do we have like the mapping of how the next, how do we call it, is going to look like? The redistricting is going to look like?
So on Thursday, the Census Bureau will be releasing the redistricting data to states, which is based on the 2020 census count from last year. they are releasing it in a format that is not super user-friendly. They'll be releasing it in a little bit more of a user-friendly format at the end of September. But there are many organizations, including the data hub that I mentioned that Fair Representation and Redistricting is supporting. That is one of a number of entities that's going to be trying to help put the data into a more user-friendly format and help do some of that analysis. So we'll be sharing out some of those analyses that will be available in the next couple of weeks. A number of state partners may also be able to speak to sort of what they're going to do with the data to make it more understandable for communities to be able to leverage it and use it as a means to be able to map and advocate for their communities.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. And I know that Kate from Maine Voices Network will talk a little bit more about what the Maine process looks like, especially because that September 30th date probably won't work very well for us, given the tight nature of our timeline here in Maine. So to have other folks help to push that information out in a more accessible way would be phenomenal, Jocelyn. So thank you, Jocelyn. I think that I really appreciate your presentation and all the resources that you shared. They will be available on our website and sent out to everyone who's attending this for you all to access and review later on. I want to invite Kiki Jameson from the Fund for New Jersey to speak a little bit more about her experience and the Fund for New Jersey's experience making redistricting a strategy or part of their strategy. And I was excited to hear from Kiki because this is really the first year that they're engaging in this work. So they're just a little bit ahead of where MPC and MPC members are at, and so they are on a good pathway. They have some really interesting learnings and are really open to sharing exactly how they've gotten to where they are. So Kiki, I'm just going to kick it off to you and I will pin you for folks to see.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. And if I can have the ability to share screens, that would be great too, please. So hi, I'm Kiki Jameson here from the Fund for New Jersey. I'm here in New Jersey in my basement office where I've been for many months, but really glad to be with you today. For us in New Jersey, it all started with the census. We created for the first time ever a statewide coalition of funders and nonprofits who were working with the state and city and county governments to put together a really thoughtful statewide effort aimed foremost at helping hard to count places, that is primarily communities of color and immigrant communities, to be counted in the 2020 census. And working together, we helped more New Jerseyans to complete the census than ever before. And though we faced many challenges, New Jersey was one of the first places to be shut down because of COVID, and we shut down in March, right, just days before Census Day 2020. We were able overall to exceed the Census Bureau's own estimate by 4.5%, the most of any state this decade. So we're really happy with the census results overall. We're eager to see the more detailed data as they are released on Thursday and soon after. But all of this has been leading us up to redistricting because, as Jocelyn said, counting residents is the very first step. But for their voices to be heard and for their interests to be elevated, they need to be represented. And in New Jersey, this redistricting process, right, the building blocks of participatory democracy, involved mapping boundaries for 12 congressional seats and 40 state legislative districts. I was doing a little poking around for the Maine system, and I recognize that our numbers are really different than yours. More congressional districts and far, far fewer state legislative districts. In New Jersey, each state legislative district yields 1 senator and 2 assembly people. But in New Jersey, as elsewhere, districts have been used, and the drawing of districts has been used historically to preserve the power of the powerful. To preserve the privilege of the privileged. New Jersey, like Maine, is a blue state. Right? Democrats control both branches of the legislature and the governor's office. But that doesn't mean that New Jersey has naturally occurring fair redistricting. Indeed, our redistricting has not been fair. In the past, one criterion that has been used is protecting incumbency. And that means that the districts that are housing candidates running in 2021 are vestiges of those that were drawn 20 years ago. And we all know that the state and populations have changed a lot since that time. I want to share you one chart we put together that helped to make the case to funders and nonprofits that it made sense to engage in redistricting. And that's this. This is just a really quick bar chart that shows the disparities between state population and representation in New Jersey. And the blue bar is the proportionality of state population. You see that white people are about 54% of New Jerseyans. The orange bar is representation in the state legislature. So white people are 54% versus 75% for the state legislature. And then the green bar is the representation on the Apportionment Commission. That is the commission of people who will be drawing the maps here in New Jersey. Now, direct representation is not the goal in itself, but it is an indicator that there is at present a mismatch between the diversity of people who live in the state, and these are pre-2020 numbers, right? And the diversity of people who are representing us. This chart was very, very helpful actually in helping nonprofits and foundations to recognize that if we didn't get involved in fair redistricting, then the process would only continue to be partisan and partial. And that if we wanted to promote fair redistricting, then it was important for nonprofits and foundations to join hands and work together to make the process as a whole more transparent, more responsive, and fundamentally more accountable to democracy. Our challenges in New Jersey are perhaps similar to yours, perhaps a little different. So for us, we have we're moving very, very quickly, but these boundaries won't come into play until the 2022 and 2023 elections. A big challenge for us is that our state legislative commission is not required to hold any public hearings. The Congressional Commission is required to hold 3. And historically, public input has had very little effect on this process. So in 2021, we decided to think about the challenges we face, but also about the opportunities we had to make redistricting in this round different than it has been in the past. Some things that were helping us that I think will help you too. First is a growing national conversation about the importance of protecting democratic institutions and advancing fair rules. Second is the extended timeline that allowed us for more time for organizing and preparation, and we hope for more public engagement. We also saw that there was significant population changes in New Jersey and demographic changes, and we as funders invested in some mapping research early on that helped to make this case. And we worked with George Chung from a group called More Equitable Democracy, and I'll show you just a sampling of what he put together. Second, here we go. So what he did for us was to look at, this is 2018 ACS data in New Jersey to help us see the population change over the last 8 years by legislative district in the state. And the green areas are the areas in which a lot of there was significant population growth. The red areas are population loss. And this helps to make the case to funders and to nonprofits that this is not a localized issue, that this is an issue, this issue of fair representation affects every corner of the state. The other thing he did was to show us the change in the population growth of communities of color. And this is shown by legislative district over the last 8 years. And what you see too are significant changes. This helped us to make the point that equity demands that we take that we're interested and we take a public interest in redistricting. And I strongly encourage you to think about doing some kind of statewide population analysis if you can, to help make the point that there are equity issues and there are fair representation issues that go beyond any political party. Sorry, I'm getting spam, like fax spam on my printer next to me, so sorry for that noise. What we also had working to our advantage was a statewide network of nonprofit organizations that have been cultivated through our census work. We had well over 100 community-based organizations that have been working together to reach their communities and help their neighbors to be counted. These organizations, through census, had developed concrete skills and understood how effectively to explain civic processes to residents and how to help community members participate. And this nonprofit infrastructure, beginning with what in New Jersey is known as the Fair Districts Coalition, focused on bringing public accountability and community participation to redistricting, would form the building blocks of our plan. So beginning in 2020, we worked with nonprofit leaders to develop a plan, and these nonprofit leaders developed this collaborative plan of action and a budget of $970,000. The focus was two-part. One was to have broad statewide focus on fair process and public engagement, to be clear about developing a narrative that talked about the importance for everyone beyond party of fair redistricting and fair representation. And this is going to include, has already started to include public events, explainers, infographics, etc. The focus here is on culturally specific communication to make sure that communities that may want to participate and need to understand about this are given information that's useful for them in language and in culturally appropriate ways. It also was trying to create a drumbeat of expectation that the commissions demand public engagement and need to be publicly accountable. That even though many of the people on the commissions are appointed by partisan people, that they have a role to play that is beyond partisan. The second part of this is, I'm sorry, can you hear me over the printer? Anybody?
Yes, yep,
Yes.
we can still hear you, yep.
I'm really sorry about this. And I don't know how to turn it off now. The second part is community engagement, prioritizing communities of color. And so what we've done is to fund outreach and organizing capacity for 3 statewide networks focused on Latinx communities, Black communities, and immigrant communities. Empowering those community members and community organizers to help citizens and residents advocate for fair representation, to draw their own maps, to offer testimony and maps to the commissions, and to inform public discourse. And this support for community groups is underpinned by technical assistance from 2 of our state's institutions of higher education, 2 universities that are providing high-powered data analysis and also mapping training. In order to put this all together, New Jersey funders had to band together. So what we did early on is to hold several education sessions for funders who then participated in a pooled fund housed at the local community foundation. And by working together collaboratively and having a number of participants, we're able to really live the values of promoting a nonpartisan, non-political community engagement process that's required for fair redistricting. We made the case that fair redistricting requires efforts throughout the state, and by having funders from a variety of places, from a variety of backgrounds, we're able to make that message count. It also helps the nonprofits doing community support and engagement to not be tied to a single funder, but to the collective. So foundations who participate in this fund aren't tied to a single grantee, and the grantee isn't tied to a single funder. And this helps us both to effectively get resources to the nonprofits that need support, but also to depoliticize with a small p this whole effort. The fundraising began in late March, and I'm really, really happy to report that as of last week, we met our goal of raising $970,000 for this effort. It reflects the contributions of 9 foundations that are diverse themselves. We have a family foundation, private foundations, place-based foundations, state-focused foundations, national foundation, even a corporate foundation, and a grant from a national funder collaborative. And the grants themselves range from $15,000 to $270,000. In addition, we found some aligned support and aligned funding to help support outreach to AAPI communities and additional funding to help support legal expertise and guidance. Those first grants were distributed in early June. Now, we're all waiting with bated breath for Thursday to see what happens. We know that our process will really kick into gear in the early fall and likely will continue through the end of the year. But we are feeling hopeful that this effort to engage a variety of nonprofit groups, to put equity at the center of the work, to engage a coalition of funders to support it, and to have a plan up front that emphasizes public engagement and accountability, that all these things together will help us to have more fair redistricting in New Jersey than we have had in the past. And we're eager to see what happens, and certainly know we're going to learn a lot along the way. Thanks.
Thanks, Kiki. Does anyone have any questions for Kiki and how she moved that process through her foundation and engaged community members along the way?
I have a question for you, Kiki. How did you engage your community? What was the process?
So we started with, thanks for the question. We started with groups that had been really active in the census and talked to them about what was coming next. I think one of the things that's frustrating for community groups in particular in New Jersey is that what I referred to earlier, the sense that we're a blue state, so everything must be fine. And the representation in New Jersey is just not what it should be. The machine politics are very, very strong, and there are too many communities that are pushed out and locked out of the legislative process. And they know this, and they're eager for ways to try and change the system to make it more permeable and more responsive. So it was not a hard sell at all.
Thank you.
Any additional questions for Kiki? Or
I have a question. Thank you, Kiki. This was really informative and really ties to the work that I do. I manage and coordinate a funders collaborative called the Immigrant Refugee Funders Collaborative, and we also do have been doing pooled fund strategies and supporting communities more specifically during the pandemic by pooling resources together and ensuring that community is supported in this way. One of the questions that I have for you in terms of this multilateral approach where you engage the state, municipal, and nonprofits, if you could speak to some of the challenges that you may have encountered in this process in terms of really coalescing or bringing people to the table. And yeah, I would love to hear what your thoughts are. I know in the context of our work, we've been thinking about that more intentionally as it relates to creating more intentional relationship, not only with nonprofits and community-based organizations, but also with the state in various municipals across Maine.
Sure. So we had really good relationships with the state and with counties and municipal governments for the census. But in the redistricting work, it's been entirely nonprofit and foundations. New Jersey has a different system in which basically the political parties appoint members of these commissions, and we have two separate commissions, one for congressional and one for state legislative. There can be sitting legislators on that, but it's not a legislative process. And because of our own concerns about managing the restrictions and opportunities for lobbying, we've really kept it out of, we haven't dealt with people as elected officials, for example, with the state. But what we see in New Jersey that may be applicable to Maine too is really significant population growth over the last 10 years. As shifts in the centers of population density and a really wonderful and significant move toward more diversity in the state. And it is our shared effort to figure out how we can work together to make sure that the legislature that will be representing us 10 years into the future looks more like the complexity of New Jersey as it is now than as it was 20 years ago. But that message of fairness is really what resonates. I think the biggest obstacle we faced is the sense of inevitability that some people feel, the sense that, well, it is what it is. The powerful people won't give up any power they have. And so it's all a lost cause before we even try. And so bringing optimism and a sense of shared effort to the work has been really important to both to raise the money and to keep things moving forward.
We have one question in the chat box. I'm curious how COVID impacted your process or ability to fundraise for this.
I think if anything, COVID helped our ability to fundraise, both for census and for redistricting, because COVID exacerbated the disparities and injustices that already existed and made them really, really evident to people who might have tried not to see them before. And so this message of equity resonated differently than it might have 2 years ago, in which foundations, funders and nonprofits that might not have thought that equity was at the core of what they did, recognized that to go forward and to be effective and to do the right thing in New Jersey, it had to be, equity had to be at the core, and shaping the rules of representation in a way that is open and transparent and responsive is a fundamental way to achieve that.
Thanks. Kiki, I think that's all the time that we have for you, but I'll share out the slides, and she has some great resources that are already uploaded to that site that I had linked earlier, including a lot of really good messaging that she has given us permission to tweak and use and create for our own state. And so thank you for that template, Kiki, and thank you for your collaborative spirit.
Thanks, and anything we can do to help, please let me know. We've gotten help from so many other states, and we're happy to pass it along and share.
Amazing, thank you. So now I'm gonna throw it on over to Kate, who's gonna share a little bit more about where Maine is at in the process for Maine, which I know that you all are all waiting for. I'm gonna remove the spotlight from Kiki just so that you all can be looking at Kate once I figure out what the heck I'm doing, but I'll stop talking, and Kate, you can go ahead, sorry.
No worries. Can you all hear me?
Yep.
Awesome. Wonderful. Well, hello, everyone. It's wonderful to be here with you today, and thank you to the previous presenters. Wonderful to learn what's happening nationally and in other states. My name is Kate McClellan. I'm the executive director of the Maine Voices Network, and I use she, her, hers pronouns. And I'll be talking to you a little bit about what's going on in Maine. Hope to be as comprehensive as possible, but certainly there's lots of work happening. So we'll do my best to cover everything that we have on our radar. And so with that, here's a little bit about what I'll be talking about today. We first are going to cover just a little bit about our organization at Maine Voices Network, so you have some context. Second, some of the redistricting context in Maine, and specifically some of the process information. And then we'll hear a little bit from one of our partner organizations, Democracy Maine, about their work on the redistricting efforts, and then see if you all have any questions. And if I do look over here to my left, it's because I have my slides over here. So I hope that isn't too distracting here and there. So first of all, just a little bit about us, Maine Voices Network. We are a state-based collaboration affiliated with State Voices at the national level. And that was formed to improve coordination and communication among nonpartisan civic engagement organizations in Maine. Some of our partners currently include union organizations, including the Maine AFL-CIO, the Maine Education Association, Maine Service Employees Association, environmental groups, including Maine Conservation Alliance and Natural Resources Council of Maine. We have Maine Equal Justice, the Maine People's Resource Center, Planned Parenthood of Northern New England, Democracy Maine, Gateway Community Services, Greater Portland Immigrant Welcome Center, Equality Maine Education Fund, Maine Women's Lobby Education Fund, among others. And overall, we work towards ensuring that we as a state are moving towards a just, equitable, and prosperous society that treats every single one of us with dignity and respect, as well as a society in which government reflects the race, class, and gender diversity of our communities and is a vehicle for addressing challenges that can only be resolved collectively. So a little bit about what we do. First, we leverage resources. So that can mean funding. That also means data and research and program support. We have a staff here that works to use our expertise to benefit and move our collective work forward. Second, we coordinate state and national strategies around policy advocacy and civic engagement here in Maine, again, working in coordination with our partner organizations. And then lastly, we drive communication and coordination among those partner organizations, working towards shared goals, both short-term and long-term in nature. So the main event, what we're all here for, redistricting here in Maine. So as you all know, and as has been mentioned and covered very well by the speakers before me, every 10 years, we have this opportunity to determine what the districts will look like for the next decade. Here in Maine, this, as everywhere, this has a very tangible, real impact. And especially looking, for example, at the state legislative level, last session, legislative session that just ended, a strong progressive majority allowed us to pass important reforms like online voter registration, the extended producer responsibility law, which is the first in the nation, very exciting, and racial impact statements for legislation that's being considered at the legislature, among many other really exciting and important reforms that just really underline the important impact that fair representation has in moving our state forward. So a little bit about the process of redistricting here. And hopefully this is relatively comprehensive. Happy to answer other questions as we continue on. Maps that will be drawn through redistricting here in Maine will be for use through the 2030 election cycle. The maps that will be drawn are the congressional maps. We have 2 congressional districts here in Maine, the county commissioner maps, the state senate maps, which there are generally 35 districts here in the state, and state house maps. There are 151 districts here in Maine. So how this works in this state is that there is a 15-member bipartisan commission of citizens and legislators. That is 7 Democrats, 7 Republicans, and a 15th member chosen by the other 14 who serves as a chair. What happens is the proposed maps, once they are devised by the commission, will go to the legislature, where they must be approved by a 2/3 margin and then signed by the governor. This year, only due to some of the delays that were mentioned earlier with the census, the commission will have just 45 days to draw the maps and 10 days for the legislature to vote on them. Normally, the legislature here has multiple months to draw those maps, so the timeline is very much so condensed. So looking a little bit at the reapportionment guidelines, and these guidelines vary by state, so it is important to look at what is applicable here in Maine. What the commission is required to consider is listed here, and what they may consider is also listed. And I'll just briefly touch on each of these points. So first, in terms of what they are required to consider, 1 person, 1 vote. Basically what this means is that districts need to be as close as possible to the same size so that each person has the same power over who their representative is. This principle is derived from the Constitution, and this is the reason why we need to do redistricting to begin with. As populations shift over time, this results in different sized districts that give people in small districts more power over their legislator than people in larger districts. Second, districts should be compact and contiguous. Different states interpret this in different ways, but it usually means that extreme, oddly shaped gerrymandered districts are not allowed. Next, the whole district rule is a provision in the Maine Constitution that says if a town is big enough to have at least 1 district solely in the town, then you must draw that district. Next, political subdivision boundaries. Maine statute requires that districts cross political subdivision boundaries such as town and county lines as few times as possible. Next, they may consider interests of local communities. And they must hear public testimony, including from communities that wish to remain in a single district. I'll talk about that in a little bit. But they do not have to incorporate it into the map. Some other states it is required, but it is not required here. And then lastly, they may consider avoiding pairing of incumbents, and they have sought to avoid doing so in the past here in Maine. So a look at our timeline here. Again, this is a condensed timeline. This is not the normal timeline that Maine normally uses, but due to the census data being delayed, this is the new timeline that we are operating under here in Maine. So as has been mentioned, we are getting the data from the census on the 12th, which is very exciting. And we will begin work here. We, meaning the Redistricting Commission folks, we will obviously be also digging in, but in terms of the timeline, this is timeline related to the commission. And then after that, they have a 45-day clock to develop their maps. Generally in early September, but potentially in August, they'll be having public hearings on those maps and seeking public input. The dates of those commission meetings when they will be seeking public input are to be determined and will be announced by the commission. Then at the end of September, roughly again, at the end of that 45-day clock, the maps must be submitted to the legislature for approval. If they do not pass with 2/3 of the votes of the legislature supporting, they will then go to the Maine Supreme Judicial Court to be drawn there. And this is all having in mind that January 1st in Maine is when candidates can start collecting signatures to run for office. And so the new districts need to be finalized in order to be implemented for that date so that candidates can do that. So some challenges that are inherent in this process, and especially exacerbated due to the delays in the census. One, the condensed timeline. This not only means that the commission itself has a condensed timeline for public input, for their work, but also for public input. So whereas they would normally have a lot more time to get feedback from communities, that will be much more challenging in this timeline. Second, obviously the inner workings of redistricting are complex, even on a regular timeline, and due to the fact that this is a process that takes place once every 10 years, same with the census, really ensuring that communities understand and are able to access ways to have their input known and incorporated is something that is a challenge. And then third, lack of resources to fund this work due to that technical nature and due to the fact that it happens once every 10 years. Opportunities. There are many opportunities, and I will, go over some of those right now. So first, we have a real opportunity here to create a state legislature that more accurately reflects the state legislature, but of course all of the districts. We focus on state legislative level here at our organization, but of course all of the districts are being redrawn. So to this aim, we believe and are advocating that the commission should consult with Maine's Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities, and as well as those who have been historically disenfranchised, not counted, or not represented in the census and or the redistricting process when drawing these districts that affect these communities. So via this process, there are opportunities for these communities to build power and increase representation. So most specifically, this is embodied by the creation of minority opportunity districts. And so in that, As was mentioned previously, it is just so critical that community mapping is done and is widely done and is incorporated into the redistricting commission's work. Second, we have a huge opportunity to engage stakeholders who have not participated in and or have been left out of the redistricting process in the past. As Jocelyn mentioned, ensuring that communities have a voice in this process is just so key to ensure that this really is fair redistricting. And so we have been working to advocate for the commission to make every possible effort to engage those who have been historically undercounted and unrepresented in the redistricting process here in Maine. And then lastly, we have a real opportunity for increased public engagement with the democratic process. Due to COVID and the transition the legislature already needed to make to functioning online for a large part of this last legislative session, there's a real opportunity to capitalize on increased access and engagement in the legislative process and continue that through the redistricting process. So then this is a map of the current state Senate districts. This is a similar map to what the New Jersey map, one of the New Jersey maps that was shown previously looks like. So we did this a couple of months ago as an initial analysis of which districts will need to change based off of population changes. You can see here green districts are districts that are under population, and then yellow districts are districts that are overpopulation. So this is the kind of information that our organization works to provide to our partners to help them make decisions about how they will engage in this process and how they might want to advocate to the commission. And we use the same mapping tools as this to help partners draw community of interest maps. Similar map of the House as well. You can see here those districts that are under the necessary number of folks per district and those that are over. I will just note that this was done with 2020 census data, so it is not fully accurate, and as has been mentioned, that census data that is coming on Thursday will be the be-all end-all in terms of what this map actually needs to look like and which districts will need to change. So our approach has been to do the following to the as relates to the redistricting process. The first has been to identify priorities in collaboration with our partner, both our partner organizations and our general community allies as well, both overall value-based priorities and district-specific priorities. So for example, something that came to the forefront in a lot of our conversations has been addressing prison gerrymandering, which I believe Will from Democracy Maine will talk about in a little bit. But we have come to work toward pushing the commission to make an effort to ensure that prison populations do not cause state house districts to have an effective population size smaller than would otherwise be allowable, essentially working to address the prison gerrymandering issue. Second, we provide data support. So this, we've been focused on refining priorities into actionable recommendations. So that has involved doing some of that preliminary mapping that I just shared with you, in addition to providing resources to our partners and community allies as needed to help them in their advocacy. Which brings me to the next, which is supporting our partners in submitting public testimony or directly lobbying on shared and or individual priorities as relates to redistricting. And then we have advocating and communicating. So this has been something that we have started and will continue as the process continues on. This has been focused on communicating between organizations and decision makers where we have contacts and where we are able. So for example, one of the priorities that we have identified and has been mentioned as important previously today is advocating for the commission to be proceeding in an accessible and transparent manner. And that has been something that we have been working to communicate to the commission and other decision makers that have an influence there. And then lastly, to monitor and analyze. This is something that we will be doing as the work of the commission gets underway on the 12th. And as maps start to come together and be released to the public, we will analyze those maps and provide our analysis to our partners so that they are able to take action. So with that, I will hand it over to one of our partner organizations and one of the lovely people that works at our partner organization, Will Hayward of Democracy Maine, to talk a little bit about what they are doing.
Thanks, Kate. Thanks everyone for having me here. Can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Awesome. Saw a thumbs up. Well, hi everyone. My name is Will Hayward. I am the Advocacy Program Coordinator with Democracy Maine, which, for those who don't know, is a collaboration between the League of Women Voters of Maine and Maine Citizens for Clean Elections. We work around democracy issues, citizen and voter engagement, and education, and advocacy for policies that helps, support a well-functioning democracy. And redistricting is certainly a big part of that. So I'm just going to talk briefly first about what some of the principles guiding our organization in Maine's redistricting process are, and then on some of the work that we have been doing and plan to do as this process proceeds. So these principles I have here on this slide are the 6 things for the commission to consider that we delivered in testimony to the commission last month. So just really briefly, these principles are public input. As Kate has mentioned, something that we think is really important is public accessibility to the process, whether that's, holding an acceptable amount of opportunities for public feedback, allowing for feedback for those who can't, for instance, literally physically be in the spot that a meeting is taking place. We've also extended this to asking for the commission's website and YouTube streams of hearings to be easily accessible. We've asked for them to post additional information, such as the court ruling that changed the dates of the process, to have that all up there on the website so the public can easily follow this process. One of the other principles that we've asked for is equal representation to the maximum degree possible. This is, of course, one of the very principal core reasons that redistricting occurs in the first place, is to make sure that districts are drawn to roughly the same size and that voter power is not greatly distorted between districts. Communities of interest, of course, are a very important part of this as well. We want the commission to recognize and incorporate communities of interest where they may exist. And I'll talk a little bit about how we're hoping to engage and make sure that these communities of interest are heard and considered in the commission's process. Fourth is competitiveness. As has been mentioned a couple places, oftentimes, districts are not drawn to be competitive. There's often a sort of horse trading between the parties that go on to draw districts that are actually minimally competitive. And we don't, studies have shown this doesn't lead to particularly responsive government. So we want the commission to consider competitiveness and certainly not prioritize anti-competitiveness in the districts it draws. Markers of fairness, and this can be some of the things that are actually required by state law, such as minimizing the amount of political subdivisions that are cut over, minimizing odd geography that serves political purposes but not representation purposes. So those sorts of markers. And then finally, this attention to prison populations, and this is the prison gerrymandering issue that's been referenced. I'll talk a little bit about this on the next slide, but this is an issue. Even though incarcerated people in Maine can vote, they cannot vote at their prison address. They can only vote in their previous address of residence in Maine, but they are counted in their prison address. So this distorts the representation. Next slide, please. So what is some of the work we've been doing and plan to do around the redistricting process? So a few months ago, we held a statewide webinar on redistricting. And for this webinar, we had a guest from the Prison Policy Institute, one of the leading nationwide organizations working on prison gerrymandering. And in this, we were able to both explain Maine's process and then also really dive into this prison gerrymandering issue, which can be complex and, you know, hard to wrap your head around if you're not familiar with it. Another thing that we've done is we have submitted public testimony for one of the hearings the commission has already had. It has only had one really open to public comment hearing so far, but we were able to introduce these issues. And in fact, the commission has, you know, requested follow-up to understand more about prison gerrymandering. And we are planning to actually get testimony in either later today or tomorrow to illuminate this issue a little more for them. We are going to be working to drive public awareness of commission meetings and encouraging public comment to be submitted. We have a newsletter that is very widely read in the state where we can really, you know, report on what's happening, easily provide the links and information for people to become part of this process. We're working on revamping our redistricting information on our website, so there's a good central hub for people to follow along and understand this process. And really, we want to use our position to make sure that the public is getting engaged with this process. We are working to identify and receive feedback from potential community of interest leaders. So as I think has been stated, communities of interest are, you know, locally defined. A community of interest has to self-define. And so we are working to, you know, develop a simple survey, develop methods to go out and talk to grass tops leaders in potential communities of interest and find out what their needs are in this process. And finally, we are planning more statewide webinars, and we are looking at, and I will say this is somewhat COVID dependent and somewhat dependent on how the map process goes, but we are looking at area specific events. For instance, if there is a municipality, I'm thinking particularly some of the larger cities in the state where there are, you know, there's even more public interest in the process than other places, we would potentially look to have local events in those places. So this is some of the processes and some of the work that we're doing that is helping guiding us. Thank you, and I'll be happy to take questions too.
Awesome. Thank you, Will. I know we're just about at time. I see Jeanette coming back on video, but happy to answer any questions that folks have if they have any.
Thank you for your respective presentations. It was really informative. I had a question around the public hearing strategy. And I work with immigrant, refugee, asylum seeking and migrant communities. And I guess I will address this question to Kate first. I know that there are certain members that you're working with in the context of the coalition. Do you envision developing a strategy that allows other non-members who are in marginalized BIPOC community to be made aware of this specific opportunity? Just wanted to hear some of the thought behind that, or are you hoping to leverage some of the organizations that are working with you who live in those communities to kind of disseminate that information?
Yeah, that's a great question. So overall, Maine Voices Network as an organization works to support our partner organizations and work with other community allies or organizations on various different projects as makes sense. I think overall, yeah, we'll certainly rely on our partners to help disseminate that information across the state, but are always open to collaboration and also expanding the reach of the work and sharing any information we have, and happy to connect directly with you to talk further about what that could look like.
Great. I'll plan to reach out to you.
That'd be great. Would love that.
Thank you.
We've got one more minute. Does anyone have any questions or any comments that they want to share before we wrap things up? Perfect. Sometimes I get too comfortable with the silence over webinars now. So thank you all so much. Thank you, Kate and Will, for sharing this great information. All of this will continue to be available on our website. And and we'll continue to do some information sharing and education around the redistricting process as it continues to unfold. This session was provided, or the brainchild of the Maine Philanthropic Network Advocacy Committee and part of Maine Philanthropy Center's strategy to continue to support the census and beyond. And I just wanted to thank you for spending your afternoon with us, and have a lovely evening.